In this episode of the Business of E-commerce, we talk about the legal aspects of running an e-commerce business. This is the Business of E-commerce, episode 8. Welcome to the Business of E-commerce, the podcast that helps internet retailers start, launch, and grow their e-commerce business. I'm your host, Charles Pulaski. I'm here today with Richard Chapo to talk about the various aspects of the legal aspects of running an e-commerce business. Richard has been a lawyer for over 24 years. He focuses on internet businesses and helps his clients minimize their potential exposure to lawsuits. Richard provides legal advice to clients as large as multinational corporations and as small as hobby bloggers. Richard is well-versed in a variety of internet laws, so I've invited him on the show today to talk about the various aspects of running an e-commerce business. So Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, great to have you today. For starters, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how do you kind of get into the legal aspects of internet businesses?
Sure. I became a lawyer in 1992 and started practicing in the field of litigation, quite a bit of business litigation, also some wrongful death work. Burned out on it, quite honestly, excuse me, in the late 1990s. And took a 1-year sabbatical overseas in Siberia, of all places.
Oh, wow.
Came back from there and had a friend who had become CEO of a internet company. And if you remember back to the turn of the century, internet companies were quite a bit different than they are today. You could pretty much call anything an internet company, have no plan, and people would still invest in you. This company was a bit better, but he was looking for legal services, couldn't find anybody that he liked, and introduced me to the subject and started reading up on it. Next thing you know, I started pressing on and been doing it ever since.
Great. Okay. And then where are you located currently? In California?
Yep. I'm down in San Diego, where we get the 65 every winter. But yeah, been in San Diego the last 25, 30 years.
Okay. And do you mostly work with clients here in the States, or is it international? What's your kind of client base look like?
The client base is mostly in California. It's by state, not by national license. And so clients that are in California or have questions about California law, and those clients can obviously be based in California. Quite a few international clients in Japan, Singapore, Europe, that kind of a thing. They're typically looking to try to access the U.S. market, which is why they hire me, so they can comply with U.S. laws.
Excellent. So kind of for starters, when you first start talking to a client, what are some things you would look at? New client, let's say, they want to be protected. What are some of the first steps you'd start looking at when you're talking to a new client?
Well, the first thing is always to take a look at their site or their app, to get a listing for that and make sure you understand exactly what it is, that they're doing, and then talk to them sort of globally about, what their goals are, what their original goals were, how they've evolved, because after a few years, people can swerve one way or the other. So you want to make sure you know what that is, and then to have an idea of where they want to go, what their target markets are and things of that sort. The thing you're seeing with the internet is it's being partitioned up by countries. I call this era of the internet the Empire Strikes Back, and so it really depends on who they're targeting. If they're targeting a market in the EU primarily, then the concerns are significantly different than if they're targeting a market in the US, or if they're looking at China, for instance. So those are big keys. And then just basically, when you review a site or an app, if you're an experienced internet lawyer, you have a pretty good idea of trouble areas. You often see problems with private policies or terms and conditions. May not be the necessary disclaimers. A variety of those things, and kind of create a list, and then when I actually meet with the client, have a pretty good idea what's at issue, and then we'll see if there are any surprises in the conversation.
Yeah, when you say privacy policies, we're seeing that was a recent development, right? Where you have to have kind of some disclosures on every single page. Is that a relatively new thing?
Well, in the U.S., privacy law is pretty weak. In fact, it kind of doesn't even exist. There really is no U.S. federal privacy law, unless you're talking about specific areas like health records or children. But what you have seen is states issue privacy law requirements through legislation, and the FTC, who monitors much of the web, has really backed those up. And to their credit, private companies are also doing it. Google, these groups that they want to see you have a privacy policy, and so you're seeing people that are doing that. To tell all my clients to do it, and to be honest, you want to do it anyways because it's one of the few legal documents that you can write in plain English, and be transparent to the people who are visiting your site or your app. And try and be beneficial to them. What you're seeing now is, as we move forward, is privacy law is going to become more mandated, particularly dependent on the target market, and you're seeing radical changes, in how the web will work based on privacy issues. So, the future of privacy is going to be very interesting.
And is that something that's strictly state by state, or is there there's no national law with that, right?
There's no national law in the U.S. There is, however, in other countries. The General Data Protection Regulation is a European privacy law that goes into effect this coming May. And the interesting thing about this regulation is it says that you target, or if you do business with people in the EU, whether they're EU citizens or whether they're just there, you have to follow some very strict requirements on privacy, which boil down to things like you have to get explicit consent before you can collect any information from them. You have to give them a right to be forgotten. You have to take all these different steps, and the penalties are, something like up to $24 million, or 4% of your worldwide gross. It's an ugly little law. The question is, how's it going to apply, beyond the EU borders? As you may recall, a couple hundred years ago, we had a little war here about taxation without representation. And so the question is, are we going to have regulation without representation? Can they enforce that against U.S. companies? Well, obviously, Google or somebody like that has office and servers in the EU, certainly they can enforce. But if you're a retailer, in Nevada, and you don't do any business with the EU, and you have one sale from the EU, can they enforce that against you? The answer in typical lawyer form is maybe. And it's going to take, 10 years and a load of money to litigate it out. Personally, I don't think they're going to have much success, but you can't really use that as a defense. But yeah, so it's getting a little ugly. The interesting thing is so that the US has no privacy. So Facebook, Google, these types of companies, their whole business model is built on sweeping up as much personal information as they can, organizing it, monetizing it, and selling it. I mean, that's what they are. And in the EU, privacy is actually considered a human right, and a fundamental right if you're an EU citizen. And so in the EU, everything is from not the business, but from the individual. Can you get your information? Can you find out what people are doing with it? Can you demand they stop using it? All these different requirements. And so the new data protection regulation that's coming out, it's the first one since 1995. So you can imagine how much the web has changed since then. And it's just really just a draconian monster that you have to address. And a lot of people are kind of in a panic about it because, the potential fines.
Huh. And what is that law actually called? Or what is the kind of term for that?
Well, it's a general data protection regulation. It's not a law. It's a regulation. The way the European Union works is they issue regulations and directives, and other things as well. But in this case, those are the two key aspects. The directive is essentially a guide for each member state. There are 28 member states, and the member states then issue their own regulations and laws. The regulation, the thing that's coming out now, is actually binding on all of the EU members. And so each EU member will now create their own enforcement agency. Think of like the IRS for privacy. So you're going to have 28 of these groups, and they're all going to follow the regulation, and they're going to go out and start prosecuting different groups. Now, Germany and France and the EU are very aggressive. The UK, they're aggressive, but they're also sympathetic. So if you're making a good faith effort, the UK traditionally has not really issued big fines. They've just sent you warning letters and tried to work with you to make sure that you get into compliance. Whereas France is just, such a different perspective on law and on citizens' rights. So in France, for instance, to give you an example, in France, if you have a child and you post a picture of the child on Facebook, let's say your 10-year-old son, it's his birthday party. In France, you've just broken the law. There is actually a legislation that says you cannot do that without the consent of the child or a guardian of the child, because obviously if they're young, they can't give consent, they don't have the mental capacity. And the reason is you're violating their privacy rights. Now, to somebody in the U.S., that sounds rather laughable, I would think. If you go onto Facebook or wherever and you see the zillions of people who post pictures of their kids so their relatives can see it, the idea that they just broke the law is kind of laughable. Now the penalty is 1,000 francs and, up to a year in jail or something like that, none of which has ever really happened, but gives you an idea kind of the different mentality between, a lot of European jurisdictions in the U.S.
Yeah. And that's something you're seeing in, you think 2018 that will go into effect?
Yes, it goes into effect in May.
Okay.
May 25th. So what's happened, it actually was enacted at the very end of 2016 or spring 2017. It just kind of depends how you define it. But they gave time for the larger companies to try to address it. The problem is that you have to change a lot of your site to comply with it. And so for those of us who work with smaller businesses, typically what you see when these kind of legal develops happen is you'll see people come out with plugins or code that does it. Because the good old entrepreneurial spirit of Americans, they've never seen a problem they can't profit from. So somebody would release a WordPress plugin, for instance, that takes care of a lot of this. Yep. And you've seen this in the past with other laws. Problem is, we're in the middle of January and we're not seeing it. In fact, we're not seeing any. And the problem is the GDPR is so complex. I think a lot of developers are looking at it and just kind of raising their hands going, I'm not going to deal with this. Yep. So the question then becomes, how does a smaller business address it? What if you're just starting out, or if you're, 50,000 a year in sales, it's your first year. And the answer to that, unfortunately, right now is there really isn't an answer unless you know how to program. The converse side of that is when May 25th hits, I'd be really surprised if the first parties that the regulators focus on are mom and pa's cheese shop.com. That could happen, sure, but realistically, they're going to be looking for bigger fish to fry. Typically, what they want to find is a well-known company that they can hit, so that not only are they generating compliance with that company, but it makes for a good story.
Make a good example out of them. Kind of that's the first big headline.
Yeah. No, that's exactly it. If Microsoft gets hit, it has a bigger effect than if, Rick Stinky, fishshop.com does.
They probably don't want to be looked at as beating up on the little guy as well, and kind of the small entrepreneur versus, negligence on the Fortune 500s. Yep.
Well, and I was joking about the 200, the war we had 200 years ago. I would never advise my clients this because it would put them in a hard position. But if it was my site, I have my own sites, and my response to them is basically, I'm not going to comply. Come get me. Okay. But I'm a lawyer. Yeah. And I'm not only my lawyer, but
you can't say that. You can't say that out loud.
Right. But I can defend myself, so I don't incur legal fees and making that fight. So if you're listening to this and you're not a lawyer who can do that, don't take that as a course of action. go talk to a lawyer in your area and just get a plan together. And to be honest, part of the plan is going to be risk assessment. And how much can you do effectively financially, and then you can buy insurance behind that to try to get a resource that if you do get hit, there's something there, a resource, financial resource to try to take care of it. The fines are up to $20 million, $24.5 million. They do the fines in euros. If you're a small site, you're not going to get hit with a 20. You could literally probably put a middle finger up to the GDPR on your homepage, and you're not going to get hit with a $25 million fine or something of that sort.
But is insurance something you can actually do for these sort of things? And you could take out a policy and just in case. Is that an option?
It is. You're going to have to hunt around to find it. I don't know of a company that specifically does it, but that's what you want to be looking for. Insurance is often, there's insurance like your car insurance, which is a standard automatic policy. And then there are other insurance companies that write specific policies, for, custom issues or custom concerns. The goal is really to find a broker who knows what they're doing, and then just have them go hunt for it, tell them what you need, have them go hunt for it, and then read what they bring back to see if it, covers that. And again, you'd probably want to retain a lawyer for that and have the lawyer read it to make sure that, you have that kind of covered.
Read through the policy to make sure that you're actually covered for these sort of regulations and such.
Right, because shockingly, some insurance policies aren't the easiest of reads.
Yeah, interesting. So that's definitely the GDPR coming May 5th this year. Definitely looking something to look out for. And then also we hear on the state side, the DMCA comes up a lot. I know I've got that question before, and what is it? And, to be honest, I don't really have an exact answer. But that's something here in the States, right?
Sure. Yes. Well, the good news is this is a positive for businesses, unlike the GDPR. The DMCA stands for the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. It was enacted in 1998 as a federal law. And what the law is designed to do is address copyright issues online, specifically situations where a user has uploaded content to a website. So if you think about Facebook, Facebook is a brilliant business model for many reasons, but one of the reasons is Facebook doesn't actually create anything. The content on Facebook is uploaded by users. And so, they can collect personal information and all that and everything else. But the one big concern is what happens if your user uploads something that infringes on the copyright of other people. It's probably the number one legal claim online. Because it's easy to copy and republish things. It just is. And, that's kind of the cost of doing business online. But back in 1998, remember, there was no Facebook. I think Google was still called Backrub. We were in the infancy of the web. And so what happened was in a small miracle, the people in Washington, D.C., of the various parties got together and decided they were going to try to create kind of a safe harbor environment for businesses to launch online and, not get just destroyed by legal issues, because obviously copyright is a big one, and everybody could see it was going to be a big one. So what the Digital Millennium Copyright Act says, it says as long as you are not the person posting the content to your site, you cannot be held liable for the copyright infringement based on that content. So I go to Facebook, I go to another site, I see an article I like, I copy the article, I paste it on my Facebook page. I've taken the article, let's say from the Los Angeles Times. They have a bot that's floating around out there and sees I posted it to my Facebook page. They go to Facebook and they go to what's called a DMCA agent on Facebook, and they send in a complaint. It's called a takedown notice. And Facebook receives the complaint. They look at my page, they take down the content, and they send me an email saying, hey, Los Angeles Times has complained that you stole their article and republished it on the page without permission. At which point I go, oops, I didn't realize that I was creating infringement. And that's typically the end of it. If I want to fight it, I then file what's called a counter notice, and we get into the technical aspects of the GDPR. What listeners need to understand, if you have a business site or something of this sort, is Facebook is immune so long as they follow that process. Which means that they cannot be sued for the infringement that I cause. So on your site, if you
Facebook is immune, but the entrepreneur is not from this.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So if you have a website or an app and you allow people to leave reviews, post any kind of content, photos, videos, music, anything, you want to comply with the DMCA, because what's going to happen is if you do that and you designate your agent, which I'll talk about in a second, somebody sends in a complaint to your agent, and your agent gives it to you, and you follow the compliance process, you cannot be held liable. You just got to, pass jail card for copyright infringement for one of the most common complaints that's out there. And so it's a huge benefit, and you should definitely comply with it. And so compliance is pretty simple.
And this is one of the times if third parties are putting content on your site.
Correct.
Then you can't.
Now,
okay.
If you're putting content on your site, it doesn't protect you.
Gotcha.
So if you're going out, and copying photos and posting them on your site, no, you're out of luck. But if you're going, most sites these days have some interactivity. There's the idea of getting the user involved, the visitor involved in the site. So forums, whatever it is. And again, even if it's just a comment section. You want to go ahead and try and get them to comply, so that, or you want to have the DMCA there so that if somebody does post something gets through, you're protected. The cost is, compliance is essentially $6, and the $6 comes from the DMCA agent. So as part of the compliance process, you have to register a DMCA agent with the Copyright Office, the United States Copyright Office, and they have a website, copyright.gov. And the cost is $6. The DMCA agent is the person that your website designates to receive complaints. So if you've ever had a corporation or an LLC, you designate an agent for service process where legal documents come in. And that's it. That's, essentially the big part of it. The thing with the DMCA agent you have to be a little careful with is the Copyright Office changed the regulations a couple of years ago. And now you have to list the physical address where the business is run, phone number, and the email address of the agent. This can be a problem if you're working from home. Nearly every website has some, let's call them fans, that you would probably never want to meet in public. The question becomes, do you want to have that public information out there or not? And the good news is you can go out and designate agents, designate other people to act as the agent. You can, if you have a lawyer, they will often do it for free. And if you don't have a lawyer, you can use a site like agentservice.com. It's an excellent site, excellent service. I should know. I own it. And we charge $70 a year to be the agent.
What was the name of that again?
It's DMCA agentservice.com.
Okay.
Not the most creative name, but a good service. But the point is to get into compliance with, and you could be the agent yourself. So if you have an office somewhere, it's not your home, then obviously you can list yourself as the agent if you're comfortable with that. Just always realize the general rule of the internet: if your name is out there on a site, somebody's going to be able to find it.
Yep.
And even if you try and take it off, they'll still find it because of all the old historical sites, the archive.coms and those kinds of things.
The Internet Archive never forgets.
No, it does not. So the DMCA is something that I would definitely recommend any site that allows anybody to do anything, submit anything on, take advantage of, because again, it really limits a lot of the risk that you have on operating online.
And now, how about on the other side? Let's say, because I've heard stories about this kind of recently, quite a bit actually, where someone else finds their photos or that they've taken of their e-commerce products or their descriptions or even Amazon listings or something like that has essentially been ripped off by a third party, and they kind of find they've been victim on the other side to someone taking their copyrighted material. What do you do in this case if you found someone's kind of violated you?
Right. Well, first, you have to determine, is it copyrighted material? Have you actually registered for copyright for the material? And usually the answer is no.
Okay.
And the reason being, just most people don't. It's $35. It's a pain in the rear. Most people just don't think about it. The web moves so quickly that most people just create content and on they go. So if you haven't registered within 90 days of the creation of the content, you would have to prove what's called actual damages. There are some other.
And now you'd have to register for
you have to prove some.
And sorry, you'd have to register for every particular piece of content. Let's say I took 100 photos of 100 different products. I would have to register each one separately as a copyright.
You could register them as a group. Sometimes it depends on the specific item. So if it was a video, you would have to register each video. If it was a book, you register each book, unless it's a group. Books all on the same subject. With photos, you often can register them in groups. It just kind of depends on what it is. The Copyright Office has some pretty good circulars. They're called circulars in their help section that really describe what's going to happen. And you'd have to take a look at those. But the key thing is you have to do it within 90 days. If you don't do it within 90 days, you have to prove actual damages, and that can be hard because, what's the value of a picture on the web? And that's a legal argument that gets out there. If you do register before the 90-day period rolls by, then you can get what are called statutory damages. And basically what that means is a jury can award between $250 and $150,000 per image. And how that award is rendered depends on a lot of factors that come down to basically, how bad was the infringement? Was it an innocent infringement? The person that did it didn't know what they were doing, or was it, malicious and intentional and those kinds of things. So that's, the thing that you have to figure out. The key thing to understand is that you have to have registered the copyright with the Copyright Office before you can actually sue somebody. So if you haven't done that, you can't sue them. So should you go register? Well, what a lot of people do is they use the DMCA, just as we had discussed. So instead of being the site that has content on it, you would go to whatever sites that you saw your content republished on, and you would file a DMCA takedown notice. You're not going to get any kind of monetary reward or anything, but typically it'll get the content taken down. And now if it's not a third-party website, if you think, the site in question was the site that actually copied it, so somebody just republished your blog on a new domain or something of that sort, then what you want to do is look up their host.
Okay.
And complain to their host, and the hosts are very reactive, and they'll usually move it pretty quickly.
So let's say it's like a Shopify, a BigCommerce, go straight to them instead, or even if it's like a self-hosted site like a Magento or WooCommerce, you'd want to find Rackspace or HostGator or wherever they're actually hosting the site and file the notice with them. And then how about if it's something like an Amazon, eBay, and someone's taking your listings? Would you file the notice with Amazon or eBay type of thing, or how did that work?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. You're just looking at wherever they're republishing it, and yes, you would go to those sources and look at them. And it can be anything from somebody copies parts of your content and puts it in an app. Then you have to go to iTunes, the Apple process, which is slow and painful, but it is there, and they eventually get around to it.
And
one of the things I would just mention is if you're going to create content and put it online, you need to accept that people are going to copy it.
Okay.
If you get outraged every time somebody copies it, you're going to stretch yourself out unnecessarily. It's just part of the web. Has positives, it has negatives. One of the negatives is stuff gets copied, and a lot of times, we like to think of some malicious kid in his garage, but a lot of times it's just an automated bot floating around copying things. So unfortunately, it's part of business online.
So it's something you're not always going to go after them for. You just want to kind of be on the lookout, but depending on how egregious it is and how much it's actually affecting you.
Yeah, people have a lot of different views on it. I have some clients who, if they release a product, say a course, they'll fight the good fight for a year or 6 months or whatever. But then after that, it's just not worth it financially. And two, to some extent it's free publicity, because if people find that site and they, that course, and they think it's good, they're likely to go look at who it was that created it. In other cases, you always need to think of the practical when you think of the legal. So I've represented bands in the past, and they have a seizure because somebody posted a video of their concert performance. These are not big bands; these are little bands. Their concert performance, and they want to go after them. And I'm reading the description, and the description is, I just discovered this band. These guys are great. You should listen to these guys. Well, do we really want to go after a fan?
Yeah.
Is it copyright infringement? Technically, but going after your fans, generally not a good idea.
In some cases it could be a good thing. That's free publicity. Someone's using a product. Maybe you can't put the shirt with some logo on it, and they're just showing that off somewhere else, right? So it's not always someone. Yeah.
Yeah, and in some cases you have to be a little careful. I mean, if you can't let everything slide, because then there's a question about whether you've done anything to enforce your, or to waive your rights under the copyright. So you may want to send them a release saying, hey, we really appreciate you posting the video and getting our name out there. That's great. Just, technically, we want to make sure, that you understand that we're giving you a release to do that. Our stupid lawyer is requiring it. Blame the lawyer, and that kind of thing. And here's a free T-shirt, or we're going to be in show, we're going to be in town next month, and there's a free pass, come by and meet us or something like that. Because frankly, if somebody's going to promote your products or you or your site online, I mean, that's a valuable person.
Yep.
So you should be trying to develop relationships with those kinds of people.
So is this something you'd recommend? So let's say you're a retailer and you have these different kind of things happening. Would you recommend someone working with a lawyer to begin with, and when something like this comes up, you kind of have a quick phone call, send a quick email, or like a case by case? So how does this, what's the engagement like with between a business and their attorney, and how's that work?
Well, in a perfect world, yes, you want to work with an attorney from the beginning. If we're honest, cash flow doesn't always allow for that. But I think when you get to a point when, the earliest you can do it, definitely talk to an attorney. So that's the base legal advice you'll hear from every attorney. The real world advice is, once you have money coming in, that you can afford an hour, it's probably going to cost you anywhere between $250 and $400. Go talk to an internet lawyer. Look one up in your area. They can be a little tricky to find, but if you go on Google and do a search for internet business lawyer and then run them through Yelp, you usually can get an idea who's pretty good. And go sit down with that person for an hour and show them what you're doing. And generally what they will do is create a list for you and say, well, maybe they look at it and say, everything's great, you're fine, go ahead. Alternatively, they'll create a list saying, well, you have all these issues that need to be addressed, and here's the priority. And you just work through the priority.
Yep.
Just like any other to-do list. I'm an attorney. I don't know much about accounting, and I hate taxes. And so I go to my accountant once a year, twice a year, and he puts a plan in place so I can minimize my taxes, and I just do it. I don't like doing it, but I do it, and that's part of doing business. So I would view it as that kind of a process. And then depending on the lawyer, you would have some kind of relationship with them where something like that pops up, where somebody's getting your content or something, you can contact them and just say, hey, I'm having a problem with this, and they look at it and take care of it.
Okay.
I mean, most of my clients, I'll be honest with you, most of my clients, I've had one client, we were laughing, actually. I just saw him last week for lunch, and I've had him as a client for more than a decade, and it was the first time I've seen him in 10 years, just because we do everything by email. And,
is that something, most of your clients are kind of just doing everything remotely now, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Which is nice.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, there's a lot of, even the accountant here and things like that. I've met them a couple times maybe, and it's been, via the phone most of the time. Any questions, that sort of thing, email, and it's been great. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, I maintain an office. I call it a semi-office. I have an office. I'm in San Diego. I have an office in an area called Del Mar with a friend who has offices, and I go maybe once a month. That's just because it just isn't necessary. And I'd love to tell you I'm sitting here, doing this interview dressed in a 3-piece suit, but I'd be lying.
The power of the internet, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Like I said, there's some good things and some bad things.
So then what are some of the things? So these are kind of the privacy. These are some of the topics come up all the time and everyone's kind of aware of. What are some of the lesser known topics that maybe you should, think about that you don't necessarily even come to your attention when you're getting started? Do you have any kind of?
Well, I think one of the biggest things, when you're starting out, is how many founders do you have? How many people are involved in the startup that are going to have an ownership position? It's a strange question, perhaps, when we first think about it. But the issue that you have is when you start up and let's say you form an LLC or you form a corporate, even just a partnership, you don't do anything. You have 2 or 3 people. Everybody's excited. Everybody's motivated. And everybody thinks it's going to be a wild success after 30 days and, women, limos, and the whole deal. And the reality is that never happens, or very, very, very rarely happens.
Oh, it doesn't?
And so, yeah, I know. No. Breaking news. Yep. And so what happens is everybody's excited and fired up. At month 6, 2 guys are excited and fired up, and one guy can't stand the other guy. And, you start having issues with ownership. One of the most important things is before you launch a business, is to put together an agreement, a founder's agreement, an operating agreement, whatever you want to call it, but something that addresses ownership. And when people qualify for the ownership, what their duties are, what happens if they stop showing up, if they start performing, and those kinds of things. There are a huge number of businesses out there that never did this, and they have what I like to call a hobby partner, and it's a partner that the other owners hate. And that person knows it. And so that person shows up, maybe half a week or doesn't show up at all, and they still cut him a check, and they still, give him his piece of profit on, based on ownership. And the reason being because if there's no written document and you have to go to court to try to get that person out, nobody's going to end up happy. And you're going to spend a ton of money, because what's going to happen, you're going to default to state laws. The state laws were written by people that often haven't ever run a business before, and they're written very generally because they're trying to account for all kinds of businesses. So you can think an internet business is a hell of a lot different than waste business, and so the rules are just nasty and unpleasant and ugly. And in fact, if somebody comes to me with one of those cases, it is so grim that I will not take that case. I don't care how much money they offer me, because I've done it before and regretted it every time. It's a divorce. It is literally a divorce. Child is the business.
So it's something though at the beginning, if you're, focusing on it, you can kind of before it happens is one of those things, after the fact, it's not the thing you should be focusing on. But if you kind of get to it, when everyone's still friendly and still happy and still cordial, then that's kind of the time you can sit down and actually look at this with a level head.
Right. And the key important thing to understand is at that point, everybody's still friendly and there's no money.
Yep.
And there's no potential. And so if you sign that out, let's say you have that agreement, and let's say 6 months down the line, two guys want to go in one direction with the business, the other guy wants to go the other direction, and it's getting ugly, and it just becomes apparent it can't proceed. Well, at that point, we'll walk into court. Well, we don't even walk into court. One party that is just going to serve a letter on the other one saying, here's what our agreement says, and we're invoking this, and we'll pay you or whatever. And then at that point, negotiations happen, but they're happening around the structure. And that person leaves. If it doesn't work out, then you go into court, and the judge says, "Well, do you have anything in writing to address this?" And you say, "Yes." And the judge sighs in great relief, and because he doesn't know anything about your business, and you put that document up there, and then the judge says, "Well, it says this, this, and this, and that's your signature on the bottom, right?" "Yes." "Well, I hereby order." Boom. I mean, obviously, it's more complex than that, but the point is that you get through it quickly.
Yep.
You have something in writing. Now, if you don't have any of that, you get up there and you have a 65-year-old gentleman or lady judge who doesn't know anything about your business, and they're going to decide how it's going to be divided up and how it's going to be run.
Yep.
And so you can imagine that's usually not a good result.
Probably something you and the founders want to decide together instead of having a third party to decide for you later on.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I've literally had, I can't even tell. I had a friend that went through this just recently, and it came down to finding a new person to invest in the company, and that person got so angry at the person they were trying to purchase the interest from that they eventually went up to their door with $50,000 in cash and said, "Look, you either sign it and take this, or I'm leaving, and beep 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 you." And and the guy took the money.
Yeah.
And he left. And the funny thing was, 2 months earlier, he could have gotten 3 times that.
Yeah. Okay. So it's something sooner rather than later. It's definitely the time for that. So even if you're already established and you're running, but you're still cordial and that sort of thing, it's not too late to start thinking about this now. Before there's actually
definitely it's. Yeah, you definitely want to do it before the meltdown, even if you have already started. Now the careful thing you have to be careful about is it can cause the meltdown.
Yep.
Because if everybody has ideas in their mind about how things are going to play out, and suddenly you realize that what you thought was going to happen isn't what the other person thought. Well, that can lead to problems. So, and then there's a couple other things just from the internet side that are a bit more internet oriented. If you have a retail site and you're selling something, you're selling products, you need to have people check a box during the checkout process that says, "Yes, I agree to the terms and conditions and privacy policy of this site." Okay.
And that's during the checkout process.
Right. And you'll see this on some sites, and you don't see it on others, which is pretty surprising. What has happened is in 2000, when the web was launching and all was wonderful and we were all going to be billionaires, you had a bunch of 60 and 70-year-old judges who couldn't set up their own email. Fast forward to 2017, 2018, and now all the people who were kids using the web in 2000 are judges, and they understand that just putting a link at the bottom of the site that says terms and conditions and privacy policy, that nobody scrolls down there and looks at them. And so the modern trend in the courts is they're not going to hold your customers liable, or they're not going to hold them to those documents because nobody ever saw them. And so you want to have that check the box process, and you want to make sure it creates a log, for each transaction, because that is effectively like a signature, if you will, for a contract or something of that sort. If you don't have that, your terms and your privacy policy will often not be enforceable, and that's important. And I realize terms and conditions and privacy policies are perhaps the most important subject any of you could ever think about talking about, but these documents are important. They're in your favor. They're there to help you prevent lawsuits. And they're there to make sure that when it comes time to sell your business, that you have the ability to do that. And that leads us to a second common problem that you see with retail sites and e-commerce sites, your privacy policy. Everybody likes to put this clause in their privacy policy that says something along the lines of, "We will not sell, share, or rent your personal information. We won't spam you, blah, 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 blah."
Yep.
Very noble idea. The problem is, if you ever want to sell that business, one of the assets of it is your client list or your email list. So how are you going to sell it if you just
Yes.
promise not to sell, share, or transfer that. I think this is a weird lawyery thing that I came up with, but actually dating sites are crashing and burning trying to sell themselves because they have this clause. There's a dating site called True.com. It's kind of the infamous case. And True.com is owned by a parent company that owns some other businesses, and they had problems, went into bankruptcy. So True.com was dragged into it. Another dating site you probably heard of called Plenty of Fish came along, wanted to buy the database. They offered $700,000. And attorney generals in a variety of states objected to the sale in the bankruptcy court, saying, that True.com had not to sell, share, or rent the user's information. And the court upheld that objection.
Oh, wow.
And so $700,000 went down the drain. Now, a dating site, the only thing valuable on a dating site, besides maybe the name, is the database of users. And if you can't sell that, your dating site is worth nada.
Well, in e-commerce, similar idea, right? You generate a list of, past buyers, and every month you're kind of hitting them up with a newsletter, that sort of thing. And a lot of times that is your asset. Monthly being able to kind of talk to them, let them know sales and that sort of thing. So if you can't transfer that, then that's a very large deal.
It is. It's horrible. And I'll give you a crystal ball view of an attorney that has no factual basis. But if I had to bet what's coming in the future, I would bet your email lists where you generate, join our newsletter. I would bet that within 10 to 15 years, those will be gone. Just because of the way the laws are playing out on the privacy front. But what will still exist is your customer list. So people who purchased from you, you'll still be able to email them, and that list is going to become incredibly valuable. Much like you see on TV now. I don't know about you, but if you're like most people now, you have a DVR and nobody watches the commercials. And you wonder, wow, why did they even have commercials? But if you watch a sporting event, these entities, the publishing companies, everything else will pay huge amounts of money for those rights, because when people watch sports, they tend to watch it in real time or close to real time. And so they see the commercials. It's just a fundamental change that you see in the advertising on TV. I think you're going to see that on the web.
Okay. So, but if it's
marketing,
but if it's something that they've purchased from you, is that different than somebody who's just signed up for your newsletter, or are those kind of treated the same?
Yes. No, yes. Because in that situation, the question is, what consent? How do you have consent to reach these people? Right. And typically, the one area of consent that they always allow is if you have a business relationship with them. Because think about it from my perspective. I'm an attorney. I communicate with my clients by email. How could they ever prevent that?
Yep.
They can't. I mean, that's just a fundamental, you and I exchange emails before, the show. You have to have that. I mean, there has to be some form of, otherwise we don't have any email, except for personal contacts. So that's almost always going to be allowed. It's hard to see how they would ever not allow that. I think what they're going to trim down on is in a situation where, get my free ebook and leave your email, and then I will, hit you with email messages every second day.
Spam you for the rest of your life. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
so
and we've seen this we've seen this in the past few years, right? It went from they could just get your email and hit you up every day to then, double opt in and, having to have an unsubscribe link, and it's kind of got more and more strict over, the past 10 years or so. But you kind of see it even going further than that.
Right. Well, in other countries, again, it depends on your market. In other countries, it's really kind of a dead concept. In Canada, marketing is very difficult to do. Very difficult. They passed just a brutal law. I want to say 2015, and then again going back to GDPR, what you're seeing coming out in the EU, marketing to the EU is just going to be really, really difficult, from an email perspective. Now you can do it still, but it's the check the box I was talking about when somebody purchases a product from you with the GDPR, you're essentially going to need that just to get permission to email them. You're going to need consent, and the GDPR is so bizarre that when you land on a site. So let's say you land on a site that's trying to comply with the GDPR. The first thing you're going to see is a pop-up. And the pop-up is going to tell you all the different ways they collect personal information and who they're sharing it with. And then you're supposed to check boxes, agreeing or not agreeing to which types of information sharing you want. And so you're going to end up with this web.
Yeah.
And here's the problem is that all the jurisdictions are issuing new and different laws, and I'd be just brutally honest with you, you complied with all the laws around the world on these things. Your website, when it pulled up the homepage, you wouldn't even be able to see the homepage.
We'd just be able to check boxes.
Yeah, and disclaimers and warnings and disclosures. And you go to your checkout, God forbid you actually get to the site and want to buy something, and then you go to the checkout page.
Yep.
You're going to have, it's going to be 80% disclaimers, warnings, declarations, blah, 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 blah. And it's unfortunately the empire is striking back, and who knows where it all ends up. But yeah, it's definitely kind of a scary time right now from that perspective. But anyways, make sure that, that privacy policy, the way you get around that issue with the privacy policy is you also include a clause that says, however, should this business be sold at any point in the future, your personal information will be part of the asset.
So that's something you can include in there, and you should include in there, it sounds like.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It's also a warning as to why when you go out and you buy free, you copy, you download, whatever. Excuse me, free terms and conditions or privacy policies, or you use a privacy policy generator, or any of those kinds of things. Man, you're just taking your life in your hands. None of these things cover none of those documents ever cover any of this stuff. And unfortunately, sometimes you learn about it, in a bad situation where somebody's filed a legal claim. So,
and that sounds like something too. When the user is actually accepting privacy policy X, you probably also want to be segmenting your email list so that user A accepted this version of the privacy policy. There was revision 2, and this user accepted that. But also segment between these are just folks that have signed up for like a newsletter versus an actual customer sort of thing. So really have your email list kind of segmented so you know who's agreed to what at what time sort of thing. So you need to track all the data as well.
You do now, yes.
Yeah.
It's not in the U.S., but yes, in Europe. I mean, the problem with the GDPR is, again, does it extend to us? For smaller sites, a lot of people are looking at their data and saying, okay, well, I get traffic. Well, traffic's great and all. Do you get sales? And if you get, sales from the EU, then, you need to comply. You also need to be paying VAT, the value-added tax in the EU. A lot of people aren't doing that. But if you look at your sales and you see I only get one sale a year out of the EU or something like that, something nominal, a lot of people are looking at geo-blocking. And geo-blocking is simply, precluding traffic from those areas. And, unfortunately, I think that's where the internet is headed. I'm not the only one that thinks this. A lot of people have talked about this, that we're going to see the web divided up, at least economically, into regions. Because, it's going to cost me $25,000, $50,000 to comply with, the GDPR, and I get $200 in sales a year. Well, you fill in the various cuss words you'd like to, add for the idea of complying with that. Isn't it easier just to block any of that traffic?
Okay. Yeah.
And if you do that, and if you do that and they still try to come after you, I could guarantee you, if you're blocking all traffic from the EU and the EU tries to enforce some kind of penalty against you in the U.S., the judge is probably going to come close to having a heart attack from laughing at them. And I give you an example. This stuff has already started. So Canada, for instance, passed a law called you have a right to be forgotten. And what that means is, mug shots, all these kinds of things that you don't like online. Well, in Europe and in Canada, you can make a request to Google, let's say, and say, somebody's listing my mug shot that was 20 years ago. Please remove that. And under that law, Google has to remove it. It's called the right to be forgotten. Yep. And that can be a good thing, bad thing. Just kind of depends on what your view of it is. And they will review it. And so what the Supreme Court in Canada said last year was to Google, because Google was still listing those contents in the U.S., and they said to Google, you have to remove them from the U.S. listings. And Google said, no, you don't have any jurisdiction in the U.S. Yep. You can't tell us what to do in the U.S. And so it went to the courts in the U.S., and the court in the U.S., and, we can all look to the flag here in pride, said, piss off, Canada, basically. And, this is our jurisdiction. We'll do what we want here. Yep. But what you're going to see for the next 10 years is this fight between all these different groups,
where one country is trying to censor another company's kind of version of the internet, basically.
Yeah, and you're seeing it breaking up. The even talked about, with the BRIC countries starting their own internet that the U.S. would have no access to. And companies, a lot of people don't realize companies are already being forced into these choices, big companies. So, excuse me, in China, you can't use Skype. You have no Skype in China. In Russia, LinkedIn is blocked, or it was for a while. I don't know if it still is, just because LinkedIn, Russia said, if you want to collect personal information from our citizens, you have to have servers here in the country of Russia that has that information. And you could play the ominous music behind that, and whip out 1984 and, so on and so forth. And that's just kind of, the nature of what was, going on there. China's trying to get rid of the anonymity. There's a completely different law in, other countries for copyright. The EU again is passing another email law that's going to come into effect. In 2019, they're thinking. I'd love to tell you something about it, but they haven't actually drafted it yet. They're just waving it around as a threat for some reason. And that's what you're going to see is people starting to partition into these different areas. And as a retailer, you make some tough decisions sometimes and look at your business model and think, well, what do I do? Something interesting that Google has done is they obviously have their U.S. out, but one of the reasons they formed Alphabet, despite all their explanations, was they're looking at the legal issue. And so what Alphabet does is it actually has kicked out Google Spain, Google, these other areas that are problematic, and tried to separate it off. And those jurisdictions are trying to fight back, and they're saying, well, it's really just a subsidy, so it's still part of Alphabet. And Google's going, no, and you're having these fights. And you even get fights with economic units. So Ireland has always been promoting itself to U.S. companies, tech companies, as a tax favorable environment to do business in the EU. And so Apple and all these companies are over there. And this year or last year, the EU issued a fine to Apple of so many billions of dollars for unpaid taxes in Ireland. And Ireland is fighting with the EU saying, no, those taxes aren't due because it's Ireland's economic life for those companies. Because if those companies aren't getting an advantage in Ireland, they're sure as heck not going to be there. And so you literally have the economic union fighting with itself.
Yeah.
So
there is a overwhelming amount to look out for here. It sounds like
there is.
Okay. So then I guess from here, let's say you're a small, e-commerce entrepreneur, you're listening to this, you're overwhelmed, kind of just like me, your head spinning, all these different regulations, everything coming down the line. What would you kind of recommend is next steps to do from here? And let's say, you might be semi-compliant of some of these things. You're not really sure, your privacy policy, you're not really sure if your little checkbox at checkout is up to date, what the privacy policy actually really looks like. Your exposure to the GDPR, anything like that. Let's say you're just unsure. What kind of are the next steps of what you'd recommend?
I go sit down with an internet lawyer, in your state. I mean, I'm in California. I don't practice in other states, so you're going to have to find somebody local to you and show them what you're doing. And tell them you heard this, bizarre guy on, this show that was talking about all these different things and what do you need to be concerned about and so on and so forth. And you get a list, and again, he'll create priorities. It may well be, so the GDPR, for instance, everything you read online says if you collect any information from, even a single citizen, the GDPR, you have to comply, and that's just wrong. Yep. These people, they're publishing these articles. Lawyers, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. What the GDPR says is if you have to comply, if you have a website and you are offering service or products, even free, to the European Union, to people in the European Union. And it's just people located there. And then there's this discussion of what that means. And it's not, the European Union is not taking the position that if, there's a site in China selling Chinese antiquities and some guy from London, gets drunk one night, slaps his visa down and orders, 45 antiquities from this site, that it has to comply with the GDPR. It obviously doesn't. So what they're looking at are issues like, do you have, international phone numbers? Do you allow, people to check out using the currency of the EU or any of the EU countries? And there are all these factors. And so you have to look at them. And so a lot of this stuff, and I realize it's scary, and I always regret saying some of the things I do on shows because it does scare people. The point isn't to scare you. The point is to alert you that you should go talk to somebody.
Yep.
And just make sure. So go spend the hour. A lot of them will give it to you for free.
Okay. Yeah, that first consultation type of thing.
Right. And just show them what you're doing. And they can go and create list. And what I do with my clients is it's always oh crap, and these are the subjects we need to deal with now. Take down that photo. And then, here's a list of things, and, from worrisome to not worrisome to something you should get to, hopefully before you die. With the GDPR, I realize it's scary. It scares me with my big clients. But the reality is, if you're a small retailer, the chances of them, picking you out of everybody when May 25th hits, could it happen? Sure. Is it going to happen? Unlikely. Yep. A lot of these countries haven't even put together their enforcement groups yet. So, it's, is something, it's something out there that needs, you need to address. If nothing else, you need to at least address it on the exterior of your site. What I call the exterior site, meaning that if somebody is in the EU, a regulator, representative, and they look at your site, if you're going to be GDPR, compliant, they're going to expect to see a couple things like a pop-up, asking for consent. So if you have that, then there's so many people that aren't going to have it that, I don't know why they would pick on you necessarily.
And you at least made somewhat of an effort to kind of do the right thing that, hopefully you're at least moving in that direction and they respect that.
Yeah. Most of the countries in the EU, most of the member states, what you find is if you are making a good effort, just don't go slap anything up. I mean, you have to make a good effort, and you do that. Then often in the past, what I've had come in are warning letters. Okay. And not even warning in the sense of we're going to pound you into the ground if you don't make these changes. It's just like, here's the law. You may not be aware of this, and we're concerned that this may be an issue with your site. So it's not even like we're going to burn you to the ground. And because really ultimately what most of the countries are interested in is helping their citizens protect their privacy. And that's fine. I don't have any problem with that. There are some countries, France, again, Germany, they like to get a little aggressive. So, hopefully you don't run into anything with them. However, with those countries, they tend to really focus on the big dogs. Like, for instance, they really, really hate Google. And so, they spend a vast amount of their budget just making Google's life miserable in Europe. And so, they blocked Gmail. They've done all kinds of nasty stuff. So, the hope is that focus on the big guys, again, get big marks, so that everybody goes, woo, and tries to comply. And that's typically what happens. Of course, who knows? But so sitting down with the lawyer, again, and just talking to them about, here's my site, here's what I do, here are my traffic stats, and here are my sales stats. And here's where I'm getting stuff. What do I need to do?
And here are my sales broken up by, here are my sales broken up by region too. U.S., state by state, country by country, that sort of thing. So they kind of get an idea of the exposure you have to each region.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. And, it's a joke I've told many times online and on different shows and what have you is, I had a client once that got a tax from Romania, nasty letter, and they were demanding, that we pay a certain amount of tax. And, I looked at it and the client was freaked. And, I just metaphorically, wound up my middle finger and pointed it in the general direction of Romania and said, yeah, come get us. Nothing ever happened, just because, no, I'm not advising you to do that. Let's just be clear. This is not a course of conduct. Legal advice for your tax situation. Don't do that. Make sure you talk to a lawyer and let them raise the finger. But, there's just situations sometimes where you just roll your eyes and, in the real world, there's no reason to get panicked over them. The GDPR is something that's very serious that you are going to have to deal with. It's just a fundamental change in the internet. So make sure you sit down with somebody and say to them, what do I need to do? And then you make it their problem.
Okay. Well, I definitely, that sounds like a great recommendation. So hopefully everyone listening to this kind of hears that. And if they can find a local attorney or you're in California, so anyone in California, how would they actually get in contact with you? And if someone wanted to reach out to you directly, what will kind of be the next steps?
Sure. You can reach me through my website, which is SoCal, like Southern California, SoCalInternetLawyer.com. Your email, even through the weekend sometimes. Excuse me. I'm also on LinkedIn. It's just Richard A. Chapo. You can do a search for me on Google to find me. However, there's a rather nasty Mexican drug lord who used the nickname El Chapo.
That's inconvenient. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you do the search and you see DEA listings and FBI results, that's not me.
Not you. Okay.
I swear it's not me. But if you do a search for Richard Chapo, I should pop up as well.
We'll also include that in the show notes, so no confusion with the Mexican drug lord and yourself. So
Yes.
we'll make sure to link directly to your site.
I keep waiting for people to show up, start shooting me or something, but yes, hopefully not.
Okay, well, we will try our best to link that up here, so that does not happen. So definitely appreciate you taking your time today, Richard. I think that was super helpful. We'll add your info to the show notes, so if anyone wants to find you, and if any listeners are in California and you want to get in contact with Richard, definitely recommend that you do that. And Richard, thank you very much for being on the show today. Definitely appreciate that.
Thank you for having me on.
All right, thank you. Talk to you soon. This was The Business of E-commerce, Episode 8. This is Charles Pulaski, and hope to talk to you soon. Thanks. Have a good one.